Hi everyone, and welcome to the video on transmedia storytelling. Before we get started in some definitions of transmedia, I'd like to first go back to two terms that are in some ways precursors of what we now call transmedia, and that terms that you will come across as you're doing readings and so forth in this area. Now the first one is adaptation. This is a term that you may be familiar with already from high school or so forth. But basically adaptation is the transition from one text to another. So this usually occurs across media. So thinking, say, the Harry Potter books into Harry Potter films, and then Harry Potter video games, and Harry Potter Lego sets, and various other transmedia extensions, but also things that are reinterpretations. So something like Clueless, which is a film that is a modern adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma, and things like Fargo, that is a film that was turned into a television series. So although adaptation usually occurs across media, of course it still occurs within forms of media, and this is probably most recognised in terms of novels, for example. So we talk about, when we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about these sorts of reinterpretations, but not necessarily the add-on text. So as I mentioned, the transmedia type things like Lego and so forth. We're talking about explicit transformations of the texts from within media or from one media form to another. So it's important to remember that in order to adapt any text, it's necessary to make changes, otherwise it would be an identical text. This is particularly the case when you are adapting a text from one medium like a novel to a medium like film, because they have different ways of expressing things. One can spend a longer time focused on something than the other one can, so people complain that not everything, for example, fits into the Harry Potter films that occurs in the books and so forth. So what has happened in terms of studies, academic studies of adaptations, is they tend to focus on these changes, what changes have been made, and how this transition has occurred across media. So there's three main different ways to approach adaptation. The first one is to see adaptation as a kind of a translation, and this is called fidelity criticism. Faithfulness criticism. This privileges the source text and sees the source text, so the original, as the most important thing, and commends those texts that provide a mirror or some kind of essence of the original in the new text. There is the tradition of comparative studies, as exemplified by Cardwell, which put both side by side, so not so much privileging the original text, though some examples do, and try and distinguish what the differences are. Then there is the acknowledgement, and this is, I guess, a more contemporary form, the acknowledgement that storytelling techniques differ in different media. So seeing the different versions of something without having a hierarchy between them. So this is also acknowledging that we might say, something is the original, but it might not be the original that someone saw or read or so forth. You might have seen the film of Harry Potter before you read the book and so forth. So it's not necessarily for individual audience members a case of original versus unoriginal experience. So another key term that you'll come across is intertextuality. So this is basically embedded allusions or connections to other texts. So something like The Simpsons is a fine example of intertextuality, in that it uses a lot of it uses a lot of references to other forms of pop culture and so forth. A film like Scary Movie, for example, is wholly reliant on your knowledge of, say, horror genre conventions and so forth in order to make sense of it. And this, if we're talking about different types of intertextuality, and doing away with the idea of authorial intent, so doing away with the idea that it's talking, that they have to be intentional necessarily, because we can't really know if they're intentional or not. The idea of the sort of obligatory intertextuality, some films will only make sense if you know the genre or the source text that they're talking about. Usually these are comedic parodies and so forth. There's optional intertextuality, and this relies on the viewer to identify, oh, that's a reference to so-and-so, but you can get just as much out of it if you do not get that reference. And then there's what's called accidental intertextuality, which are general connections, less explicit, less specific connections to other texts. So why do we find intertexts pleasurable? We do because it's fun to be able to see a reference or spot something based on our own knowledge. It gives you something as a reader that you don't otherwise get. It takes you into the text, makes you understand the text more, but it also takes you beyond the text. And it's that beyond the text that becomes increasingly important when we talk about transmedia. So I'll now get into 3 definitions of transmedia storytelling, and some of them, they all have similarities but slight differences. So I'll first go into Henry Jenkins, who is a very famous scholar, particularly in the area of fan studies, but also more generally in popular culture. So Jenkins says that transmedia stories are based not on individual characters or specific plots, but rather complex fictional worlds which can sustain multiple interrelated characters and their stories. This process of world building encourages an encyclopedic impulse in both readers and writers. We are drawn to master what can be known about a world which always expands beyond our grasp. This is a very different pleasure than we associate with the closure found in most classically constructed narratives. So, in order to have a transmedia text, transmedia experience, the fictional world has to be complex, and it has to be complex enough to have multiple interrelated characters and their stories, which nonetheless are clearly part of the story world and part of the whole of the story. This is thinking more in terms of the audience. It has to encourage ideally at least, it encourages the audience to seek out the other texts to gain an encyclopedic knowledge of the world. And the idea is that you never can fully grasp the whole story world in a transmedia narrative, ideally, because it's always expanding. Obviously, some of them stop and you could potentially learn all of it, but I guess one of the main pleasures is in that expansion. And this expansion is very different from the closure we're used to in, say, classical Hollywood films, where all the threads need to be tied up by the end of the film. This is much less common now when we're in an age of sequels and prequels and so forth. Things are left more open-ended than they once were. So Jenkins again, in your Mattel text, transmedia storytelling represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Ideally, each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding of the story. So, important to figure out what the integral elements are, what makes the story world a story world, thinking about how this gets dispersed systematically, so carefully planned out across multiple different delivery channels, so multiple different forms of media, for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. So the idea is that each medium should make its own contribution to that story. So an example of that might be the TV version focuses on character because it has more time to explore moral ambiguities in a character or so forth. The film aspect might focus more on narrative, for example. The video game might privilege you being immersed in the world and participating in the world in some way. Toys and those sorts of add-ons encourage, I guess, an imaginative play with the story and with the boundaries of the story. So the idea is that you carefully plan how each of these contribute to each other. And you can see this in the large franchises like Marvel Cinematic Universe and Star Wars and so forth, that there is a carefully planned approach to their transmedia storytelling. So our last definition for today is that transmedia storytelling is the crafting of stories that unfold across multiple media platforms, so the same as the others, in which each piece interacts with each other to deepen the whole, so interacts with each other, so not just interacting one way as in intertextuality, but is also capable of standing on its own, is also capable of you watching it in its without necessarily going back and seeing all the text. You could potentially watch one of the Marvel movies, for example, without going and watching all the others. Again, focus on the audience, giving the audience the choice as to how deep they want to go. How do they want to have an encyclopedic approach that Jenkins suggests, or do they want to just leave it and engage with one of the films as a film, for example? What happens here in this definition is that it's unclear what the extensions or supporting acts are. So again, reflecting on the audience being able to think about that they've come in from different perspectives and different experiences. And Weaver also talks about the idea of there being so-called native transmedia, which are texts that are originally conceived of as transmedia and deliberately planned as such, versus additive transmedia, which is more in the lines of having something, it's successful, and then later on you add on different texts. Now this is an important distinction because when you have the add-on texts, they're not able to do that direct two-way interaction with each other. It'll necessarily be a one-way adaptation. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion on this. Thank you.